The most expensive mistakes are not the ones people make with money. They are the ones they try to solve with money. Rain slid down the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like silver threads against the Chicago skyline. 47 stories above the city, the world seemed distant, reduced to tiny headlights and scattered reflections beneath a dark evening sky. Inside, everything felt controlled, quiet, perfect. The marble floors gleamed beneath warm lighting. Modern artwork decorated the walls. Every detail reflected the taste and discipline of a man who had spent 2 decades building one of the most successful biotechnology companies in America. Alexander Hayes stood beside the window with one hand in his pocket. At 43, he carried the confidence of a billionaire accustomed to getting answers when he asked questions and solutions when he faced problems. Yet tonight, there was something unusual beneath his calm exterior. Impatience, perhaps even desperation. On a polished walnut table between 2 leather chairs rested a thick folder. Beside it sat a silver fountain pen. Naomi Carter noticed both immediately as she stepped into the room. She had arrived 10 minutes earlier than requested. Years of working as a pediatric nurse had made punctuality second nature. She removed her raincoat and accepted a polite greeting from Alexander's assistant before being left alone with him. For a moment, neither spoke. Naomi studied the room while Alexander studied her. She was 31 years old, composed, and impossible to intimidate. Her dark eyes carried a quiet confidence that came from caring for sick children and worried families every day. Unlike many people who entered Alexander's world, she seemed entirely unimpressed by it. "Thank you for coming," Alexander finally said. Naomi nodded. "Your assistant said it was important." "It is." He gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Please sit." Naomi took a seat. Alexander remained standing for another moment before moving to the table. He opened the folder and slid it across the polished surface. "I prefer direct conversations," he said. "So I will be direct." Naomi glanced at the folder but did not open it. "All right." Alexander folded his hands together. "I need someone I can trust." Naomi waited. "And I believe you may be that person." The statement caught her slightly off guard. They were not close friends. They had met only a handful of times through one of the children's hospitals supported by the Hayes Foundation. Their interactions had always been brief, professional, respectful, nothing more. "Trust for what?" she asked. Alexander took a slow breath. Then he delivered the answer with the same precision he used in board meetings and investor presentations. "I would like you to become a surrogate." Silence settled over the room. Outside, rain continued tracing paths across the glass. Naomi looked at him without reacting. No surprise, no outrage, no visible emotion at all. Alexander continued. "Everything would be handled legally. The best medical care, the best specialists, complete support throughout the process." He tapped the folder. "The contract is inside." Naomi finally lowered her eyes toward the document. "And why me?" Alexander seemed prepared for the question. "Because I have spent months evaluating candidates." The word candidates sounded strangely clinical. "You have an exceptional medical background. You are intelligent, responsible, compassionate." Every recommendation was positive. Naomi listened quietly. Alexander continued. "And unlike most people, you have never tried to gain anything from knowing who I am." For the first time, a faint smile touched Naomi's face. "That is your sales pitch." "It is the truth." Alexander sat across from her. "There is also the matter of compensation." He opened the folder to a specific page and turned it toward her. $1 million. The number rested boldly on the paper. A sum large enough to transform lives. Large enough to eliminate debt, buy homes, fund dreams, and solve countless problems. Alexander watched her carefully. Most people reacted immediately when they saw that amount. Naomi did not. She looked at the page for several seconds before closing the folder again. "You already made your decision before I arrived?" Alexander said. "No," Naomi's voice remained calm. "I just think it is." "Interesting." "What is?" "That you believe this meeting is about a contract." Alexander frowned slightly. "What else would it be about?" Naomi looked at him for a long moment. The rain outside seemed louder now. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass. Slowly, she reached into her handbag. Alexander expected a notebook, perhaps a list of questions. Instead, Naomi removed an old envelope. Its edges were worn. The paper had yellowed with age. She placed it gently on top of the contract. Alexander stared at it. What is that? Naomi's expression changed. For the first time that evening, genuine emotion appeared in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, something deeper. Before you ask me to carry your child, she said quietly, you should know what happened to the first one. Alexander did not move. The rain continued tapping softly against the glass walls of the penthouse while the old envelope rested on top of the $1 million contract like a challenge neither money nor influence could immediately answer. For several seconds, the billionaire simply stared at it. Then he looked back at Naomi. What did you just say? His voice was calm, but something beneath it had shifted. Naomi folded her hands in her lap. You heard me. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. I do not think I did. The city lights reflected across the polished table between them. One side held a contract designed to create a future. The other held an envelope carrying something from the past. You asked me to help you have a child, Naomi said quietly. Before we discuss that, there is something you deserve to know. Alexander leaned back in his chair. He was a man accustomed to negotiations. Investors, attorneys, scientists, competitors. He had spent years learning how to read people. Yet Naomi was difficult to read. She did not seem intimidated. She did not seem impressed. Most importantly, she did not seem interested in the money sitting a few inches away from her hand. What exactly is in that envelope? He asked. Naomi looked at the worn paper. A promise. The answer only deepened his confusion. From who? She hesitated. Someone who believed you would need it one day. Silence settled. Between them again. Alexander glanced at the contract. $1 million. The figure suddenly felt irrelevant. If this is some kind of misunderstanding, it is not. Naomi's voice remained gentle. I almost threw it away many times. That statement caught his attention. Why did you not? Naomi looked toward the window. The storm outside had grown heavier. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the skyline, illuminating distant buildings for a brief moment. Because I gave my word. Alexander studied her face. There was no performance in her expression. No attempt to manipulate him. Only sincerity. Somehow that made the situation more unsettling. Who gave it to you? Naomi slowly reached for the envelope, but did not open it. 8 years ago, I was working night shifts at St. Matthew's Medical Center. The name meant nothing to Alexander. I met a woman there. Naomi's eyes drifted toward a memory only she could see. She was very sick. Alexander remained silent. Something told him not to interrupt. Most people in the hospital had forgotten her by then. She rarely had visitors. She spent most of her time alone. Naomi ran her thumb gently across the edge of the envelope. One night she asked for a nurse. I happened to be the one available. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room. And? Alexander asked. Naomi looked at him. She asked me if I knew who you were. The question hit him unexpectedly. Me? Yes. Had we ever met? No, Naomi shook her head. I had never heard your name before. Alexander frowned. Then why would she ask? Because she wanted to make sure I remembered it. The room seemed quieter now. Even the sound of the rain felt distant. Naomi continued. Over the next few weeks, I spent time talking with her. She rarely discussed herself, but she spoke about one person often. Alexander already knew the answer before she said it. Me? Naomi nodded. She said you were a good man. The statement felt strangely personal coming from a complete stranger. What was her name? Naomi lowered her eyes. I think you should see the contents of the envelope before I answer that. Alexander stared at her. Every instinct told him to demand an explanation. Instead, he reached forward and picked up the envelope. The paper felt fragile beneath his fingers. Old, carefully preserved. Whatever was inside had survived years. Naomi watched quietly. I carried it through 3 apartments, she said. 2 jobs. Countless opportunities to forget about it. Alexander turned the envelope over. There was no address. No return name. Only a single sentence written across the front in elegant handwriting. He froze the moment he read it. Because the message was addressed directly to him. To Alexander Hayes. Not Mr. Hayes. Not CEO Hayes. Alexander. The familiarity was unsettling. Slowly, he looked back at Naomi. Who wrote this? Naomi held his gaze. For the first time since entering the penthouse, sadness appeared in her eyes. A woman who spent her final days hoping you would one day know the truth. Alexander felt an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest. He looked down at the envelope again. The handwriting, the worn edges, the years hidden inside a single piece of paper. Then, With careful hands, he broke the seal. The sound of the envelope opening seemed strangely loud inside the quiet penthouse. Alexander carefully unfolded the contents and immediately realized there was more than a single letter inside. A photograph slipped onto the table first, then a folded document, then a handwritten page covered in elegant cursive writing. For a moment, he focused on the photograph. His breath caught. It showed a young woman standing in a hospital garden beneath blooming spring trees. She could not have been older than 28. Her smile was warm, genuine, and oddly familiar. In her arms, she held a newborn baby wrapped in a pale blanket. Alexander stared at the image. Something deep inside him shifted. He had never seen the woman before. At least, he did not think he had. Yet the photograph felt personal in a way he could not explain. Naomi remained silent across the table. She knew this moment belonged to him. Slowly, Alexander picked up the handwritten letter. The date at the top made his stomach tighten. 8 years earlier. Exactly 8 years. His eyes moved to the first sentence. Dear Alexander, if you are reading this, then Naomi kept her promise longer than I ever expected. The room seemed to grow smaller. Rain continued falling outside, but Alexander barely heard it. He kept reading. I do not know whether you remember me. Perhaps you never knew I existed. Perhaps that was the point. There are people with power who decide which stories deserve to survive and which stories disappear. I learned that lesson too late. Alexander lowered the paper slightly. His heartbeat had quickened. Who was she? He asked quietly. Naomi shook her head. Keep reading. He looked back at the letter. The handwriting remained steady, even beautiful. For years, I wanted to tell you the truth myself. I wanted to sit across from you and explain everything. But life does not always give people the time they think they have. If this letter reaches you, then I am no longer here to tell the story myself. Alexander swallowed hard. He continued reading. The child in the photograph deserves more than silence, more than secrets, more than the decisions other people made on her behalf. The word child immediately drew his attention. He glanced again at the photograph. The baby, the woman, the hospital garden. Naomi, he said slowly, what is this? Naomi's expression softened. The reason I came tonight. Alexander looked back at the page. I never wanted money. I never wanted influence. I only wanted the chance to do what was right. If you are reading this, then perhaps that chance finally exists. Alexander felt tension building in his chest. Every line seemed to create more questions than answers. He unfolded the second document. It appeared to be a hospital record. Most of the medical information meant little to him at first glance. Then he noticed a name. Lily. His eyes narrowed. The name appeared multiple times. Beneath it was a birth date. 8 years ago, the same year the letter had been written. Alexander slowly lowered the paper. Who is Lily? Naomi looked directly at him. The little girl in the photograph. The answer lingered in the air. And what does she have to do with me? Naomi hesitated. For the first time since arriving, she seemed uncertain. Not fearful, careful, as though choosing the wrong words could change everything. That is the question the letter was meant to answer. Alexander looked back down. His hands no longer felt steady. He continued reading. There is a little girl who may one day ask why certain doors remained closed to her. If that day comes, I hope someone finally tells her the truth. She deserves that much. Every child does. The sentence hit him unexpectedly. Something about it felt heartbreaking. Honest. Human. Outside, lightning flashed again across the city skyline. The penthouse briefly illuminated before returning to its warm glow. Alexander read the final paragraph. If you have reached this point, then please do not blame Naomi. She only carried a burden that was never hers. The choices were mine. The consequences were mine. But Lily's future should not be. The signature waited at the bottom of the page. Alexander stared at it. Then he froze completely. Because the name written there was one he recognized immediately. A name connected to a chapter of his life he had not thought about in years. A name he believed had vanished forever. Emily Harper. The name seemed to pull 8 years of forgotten memories into the room at once. Alexander stared at the signature while a cold sensation settled across his chest. Emily Harper. He had not spoken that name aloud in years. Outside, thunder rolled softly beyond the skyline. But inside the penthouse, everything felt still. Naomi watched him carefully. She could see recognition in his eyes. Not complete understanding. Not yet. But recognition. You knew her, she said quietly. It was not a question. Alexander lowered the letter onto the table. His mind had already traveled backward. Long before Hayes Biotech became a billion-dollar company. Long before magazine covers and interviews and investor meetings. Back to a period when his future was uncertain and his life was not yet controlled by schedules, security teams, and public expectations. Emily worked at a bookstore near Northwestern, he said slowly. I met her when I was 29. Naomi remained silent. We knew each other for less than a year. A faint smile touched his face before disappearing. She was different from everyone else around me. He looked down at the photograph again. But we lost contact. Naomi folded her hands together. Did you lose contact? The question lingered between them. Alexander frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Naomi took a slow breath. Emily told me a different version of the story. Rain continued sliding across the glass walls. Alexander felt tension returning. Then tell me. Naomi glanced toward the hospital document. According to Emily, she did not leave. She was told to leave. Alexander stared at her. By who? Naomi hesitated. She believed someone from your family approached her. The answer landed heavily. That is impossible. Yet even as he said the words, uncertainty crept into his voice. Naomi noticed it. Is it? Alexander looked away. There were very few people in the world capable of influencing his personal relationships 8 years ago. One name immediately surfaced in his mind. Victoria Hayes. His mother. The chair beneath him suddenly felt uncomfortable. Emily never mentioned any of this. Naomi nodded. Because she never had the chance. Silence followed. Naomi reached toward the photograph and gently turned it so Alexander could see it more clearly. The young woman smiled while holding the infant close against her chest. There was love in that image. Undeniable love. When I met her, Naomi said softly, she was already very ill. Alexander swallowed hard. What happened to her? A rare autoimmune disease. Naomi's voice remained gentle. By the time she arrived at St. Matthew's, treatment options were limited. Alexander looked at the letter again. Suddenly, every sentence felt heavier. Every word carried the weight of time he could never recover. Why did she not contact me? Naomi's eyes met his. She tried. The answer struck him immediately. What? Naomi opened the hospital document and removed another folded page hidden beneath it. She wrote several letters. Alexander stared at the page. Several. This was the only one she believed might eventually reach you. Naomi slid the paper toward him. The others were returned unopened. His heart began pounding. Returned by who? Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she pointed toward a name written in the corner of the document. Alexander looked down. His expression changed instantly. The name belonged to a private legal office that had represented the Hayes family for decades. A law firm his mother trusted completely. The realization settled over him like a shadow. No, he whispered. Naomi said nothing. She did not need to. The evidence was sitting directly in front of him. Alexander stood and walked toward the window. The city below seemed distant and unreal. For years he had believed Emily simply moved on. Chose a different path. Chose a different life. Now another possibility stood before him. What if the choice had never been hers? What if someone had made it for her? Behind him, Naomi spoke quietly. There is more. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Of course there is. When he turned back toward the table, Naomi's expression had changed again. There was sadness there, but also concern. Emily never asked me to find you for her sake. Alexander looked at the photograph. Then why? Naomi slowly picked up the hospital record and placed it beside the picture of the infant. Because of Lily. The name hung in the air. What about Lily? Naomi hesitated. For the first time all evening, emotion reached her voice. Emily believed Lily deserved to know where she came from. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. Naomi. Yes. Tell me exactly what you were trying to say. Naomi looked directly into his eyes. Then she gently pushed the birth record across the table until it stopped in front of him. I am saying, she whispered, that before you ask someone to help you have a child, you need to know you may already have one. The words seemed to erase every other sound in the penthouse. Even the storm beyond the glass faded into the background. Alexander stared at Naomi as though he had misheard her. A child. The possibility alone felt impossible. Yet the photograph remained on the table. The hospital record remained in front of him. Emily's letter remained open beside both. None of it disappeared when he blinked. None of it felt like a misunderstanding anymore. No, he said quietly. That cannot be true. Naomi did not argue. She simply watched him struggle with a reality that had arrived without warning. I understand why you feel that way, she said. Alexander picked up the birth record again. His eyes moved across the page. The date, the hospital, the signatures. Details that once seemed meaningless now carried enormous weight. Why did Emily believe I was the father, he asked. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly. Because she never doubted it. Alexander walked away from the table and stopped near the window. Below, thousands of lights stretched across Chicago like a sea of stars. For years he had built plans around a future family that never arrived. He had consulted specialists, met with attorneys, considered options he once thought unimaginable. And now a woman he had not seen in nearly a decade was reaching into his life through a letter and suggesting that everything he believed might be incomplete. Did she ever ask for money? He asked. Naomi immediately shook her head. Never. Did she ever contact the media? Never. Did she ever try to use my name? Never. Each answer only deepened the silence. Alexander turned back toward her. Then why wait 8 years? Naomi looked at the photograph. Because she hoped she would get the chance to tell you herself. The sadness in her voice felt genuine. When her health began declining, she realized that might not happen. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Emily's smile from the photograph lingered in his mind. He remembered her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she always challenged him when everyone else agreed. Memories he had not visited in years suddenly returned with painful clarity. What happened after she passed away? He asked. Naomi took a slow breath. Lily entered the foster care system. The statement hit him harder than he expected. Alone. Not immediately. A distant relative cared for her for a while. But eventually that arrangement ended. Alexander looked back at the photograph. The tiny infant wrapped in a blanket was no longer an abstract possibility. Somewhere, that child had grown into a little girl. A little girl who might have spent years wondering why nobody came for her. The thought unsettled him deeply. Where is she now? Naomi hesitated. Alexander noticed it instantly. You know where she is? Yes. Then tell me. Naomi remained calm. Before I answer that, there is something else you need to understand. Frustration flickered across his face. Naomi, if there is a child involved, there is. Her voice remained gentle but firm. And that is exactly why I need you to hear the entire story. Alexander slowly sat down again. The confidence that usually guided every decision seemed strangely absent tonight. Naomi reached into her bag and removed a small notebook. Unlike the old envelope, this one appeared newer, carefully preserved but frequently used. Emily gave me several things, she said. The letter was only one of them. She opened the notebook and turned it toward him. The first page contained a child's handwriting. Large, uneven letters stretched across the paper. Alexander stared at the words. My name is Lily. I am 7 years old. I like drawing horses and reading adventure books. He swallowed hard. Naomi slowly turned another page. A drawing appeared. Crayons. Bright colors. A small house. A tree. A smiling little girl. Beside the drawing stood a man in a dark suit. Above the figure was a single word written in careful handwriting. Dad. Alexander felt something tighten inside his chest. She does not know me. Naomi nodded. No, then why would she draw that? Naomi's expression softened. Because Emily told her stories. Alexander looked up. Stories. About a man who worked hard. A man who wanted to make the world better. A man who cared about people. Naomi paused. Emily never filled Lily with anger. The statement lingered between them. Alexander looked back at the notebook. Every page seemed to reveal another piece of a life he never knew existed. Then Naomi turned to the final page. A recent photograph had been tucked inside. It showed a smiling little girl standing outside an elementary school with a backpack over one shoulder. Alexander froze. The eyes. He recognized the eyes immediately. They were his. Alexander could not look away from the photograph. The little girl stood in front of a brick elementary school beneath a bright spring sky, smiling at the camera with a confidence that seemed far too familiar. It was not only the eyes. It was the expression, the slight tilt of her head, the quiet determination hidden behind an innocent smile. For a moment, the years separating him from the child seemed to disappear. He lowered the photograph carefully onto the table and stared at Naomi. Where was this taken? Naomi glanced at the image. 3 months ago. Where? Milwaukee. The answer surprised him. Milwaukee was less than 100 miles away. less than a 2-hour drive from Chicago. The realization hit him immediately. For 8 years, a little girl who might be connected to him had been living closer than many of his business offices, closer than some of his executive teams, closer than countless investments he monitored every week. Yet he had never known she existed. "Why Milwaukee?" he asked quietly. Naomi folded her hands together. "Because that is where her foster family lives." Alexander looked back at the photograph. "Is she happy?" Naomi smiled softly. "Most days." The answer sounded honest. "Most days." Naomi nodded. "She is a wonderful child. Bright, curious, kind." Her smile faded slightly. But children eventually start asking questions. Alexander already knew which questions she meant. Why did my mother leave? Who was my father? Why did nobody come for me? He felt a heaviness settle across his chest. Questions without answers could follow a child for years. "You know her well." Naomi nodded. "After Emily passed away, I checked on her whenever I could." Alexander looked at her carefully. "For 8 years. Not every day, not every week, but enough." Naomi glanced toward the notebook. "I promised Emily I would make sure Lily always had someone in her corner." The statement lingered in the room. Alexander suddenly understood something important. Naomi had not come here because of money. She had not come because of the contract. She had come because she had carried a promise for nearly a decade. Outside, the storm began to weaken. The rain against the windows softened into a steady rhythm. Alexander sat down slowly. The contract remained on the table between them, unopened and forgotten. $1 million now seemed absurdly small compared to the questions surrounding Lily. "Does she know anything about me?" Naomi hesitated. "Only what Emily told her." "Which was?" Naomi looked toward the photograph. "That you were someone who once mattered very much." Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Regret arrived without warning. Not because he knew what had happened yet, but because he had lost 8 years that could never be recovered. 8 birthdays, 8 Christmas mornings, 8 first days of school. Entire chapters of a child's life had passed without him even knowing they existed. "There is something else," Naomi said softly. Alexander opened his eyes. "Of course there is." Naomi reached into the envelope and removed one final folded sheet of paper. Unlike the others, this one appeared newer. "Emily wrote this during her last week at the hospital." Alexander accepted it carefully. "I have never read it aloud to anyone," Naomi said. "Not even Lily." The paper trembled slightly in his hands. He unfolded it. The handwriting was weaker than the first letter, but still unmistakably Emily's. "Dear Lily, if you are reading this one day, it means Naomi finally found the courage to tell your story. I hope you never measure your worth by who stayed or who left. I hope you know that you were loved every day of your life. Most of all, I hope you meet the man whose eyes you inherited." Alexander stopped reading. His throat tightened. The room suddenly felt very quiet. He looked down at the final line written beneath the paragraph. "If he ever learns the truth, give him a chance to choose for himself." Alexander stared at the sentence for several long moments. Then he slowly lowered the page. "She believed I never knew." Naomi nodded. "She did. And you?" Naomi held his gaze. "I believe the same thing." Alexander looked at the photograph one more time. The little girl smiled back at him from another city, another life, another reality he had never imagined. Then he asked the question that had been growing inside him since the moment he saw her face. "Naomi," he said quietly, "if Lily is still out there, waiting for answers, why did you come here tonight instead of bringing me to her?" Naomi's expression changed. For the first time all evening, real concern appeared in her eyes. "Because before you meet Lily," she said, "there is someone else you need to confront first." Alexander stared at Naomi for several seconds after she spoke. The question of Lily's future had consumed every thought in his mind since he saw the photograph. Yet Naomi had just redirected his attention towards someone else entirely. "Who?" he asked quietly. Naomi did not answer immediately. She gathered the letters, the photographs, and the notebook into a neat stack before looking up at him. "Your mother." The answer landed with startling force. Alexander leaned back slowly. For years, Victoria Hayes had been the most influential person in his life. She had helped build the family foundation. She had protected the Hayes name through financial crises, business battles, and public scrutiny. Even now, she remained one of the most respected figures in Chicago's philanthropic circles. "You think my mother knows about Lily?" Naomi asked. "I do not think." Naomi's voice remained calm. "I know she knew about Emily. Alexander's jaw tightened. That is a serious accusation. It is also true. The storm outside had nearly passed. The rain had softened into a gentle rhythm against the windows, but the tension inside the penthouse continued to grow. Alexander stood and walked toward a nearby cabinet where a framed photograph rested on a shelf. It showed him standing beside Victoria during the opening of a children's research center funded by the Hayes Foundation. Both were smiling. Both looked proud. For a moment, he studied the image. Then he turned back toward Naomi. If my mother knew something, why would she hide it? Naomi looked down at Emily's letter. For the same reason powerful people hide many things. Alexander folded his arms. Which is, because they believe they are protecting the future. Silence followed. The answer felt uncomfortably plausible. Victoria Hayes had always believed she knew what was best for everyone around her. She called it responsibility. Others sometimes called it control. Alexander returned to the table. Emily told you this. Naomi shook her head. Not directly. Then how do you know? Naomi opened the notebook again and carefully removed a folded business card tucked between the pages. She slid it across the table. Alexander picked it up. His stomach tightened immediately. The card belonged to a senior advisor who had worked exclusively for the Hayes family 8 years earlier. A man who answered directly to Victoria. Where did this come from? He asked. Emily kept it. Why? Naomi held his gaze. Because according to her, he visited her apartment. Alexander froze. What? Several weeks before she disappeared from your life. Naomi's voice remained steady. Emily said he arrived with instructions. Memories began surfacing. Strange conversations. Missed calls. Unexplained distance. At the time, he had assumed Emily simply wanted something different from life. Now those memories seemed less certain. What instructions? Naomi took a breath. To leave. The word lingered between them. Alexander looked away. Part of him wanted to reject everything he was hearing. Another part was beginning to connect pieces that had never made sense before. Did she have proof? He asked quietly. Naomi nodded toward the business card. Only fragments. Emily was never interested in fighting wealthy people. She was interested in protecting her child. Alexander lowered his eyes. Protecting her child. The phrase carried enormous weight now. For years he had been searching for a future child, while remaining completely unaware of a little girl already growing up without answers. The irony felt cruel. Naomi continued. Emily believed your mother thought she was helping you. Helping me. Alexander laughed bitterly. By hiding a child? By protecting a legacy. The room fell silent again. Alexander knew his family history well enough to understand exactly what Naomi meant. The Hayes name appeared on hospitals, scholarships, museums, and research centers. Victoria often spoke about preserving the future of the family, preserving the reputation, preserving the legacy. But what if that desire had gone too far? What if preserving the legacy had cost someone an entire childhood? His phone suddenly vibrated on the table. The screen illuminated. Victoria Hayes. The timing felt almost unreal. Naomi noticed the name immediately. Neither spoke. The phone continued vibrating. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, a message appeared. Alexander looked down and opened it. The text was short. Call me immediately. We need to discuss the woman who visited you tonight. Alexander felt a chill travel through him. Slowly, he looked up at Naomi. How does she know you are here? Naomi's expression darkened. Because she has been expecting this conversation for 8 years. Alexander continued staring at the message on his phone long after the screen dimmed. The words seemed simple enough, yet they carried the weight of something far larger. We need to discuss the woman who visited you tonight. Not Naomi Carter. Not a nurse. Not a stranger. The woman. As if Victoria already knew exactly why Naomi had come. As if this conversation had been waiting for years. Slowly, Alexander set the phone down on the table. She knows, he said quietly. Naomi nodded. I told you she would. How? Because people who spend years protecting a secret rarely stop watching it. The answer unsettled him. He looked toward the city beyond the glass. The rain had nearly ended now. Chicago shimmered beneath scattered reflections and distant traffic lights. Everything outside appeared normal. Inside, his life was unraveling one truth at a time. You said she was expecting this conversation. Naomi folded her hands together. Emily believed your mother monitored anything connected to her. Alexander frowned. That sounds paranoid. I thought so too at first. Naomi reached into her bag once more. Then Emily showed me something. She removed a small envelope, thinner than the others. Inside were photocopies of several documents. Alexander accepted them cautiously. The first appeared to be a housing application from years ago. The second was a rental agreement. The third was a letter from an attorney. He studied the signature at the bottom and immediately recognized the name. It belonged to another legal representative employed by the Hayes family 8 years earlier. "What is this?" he asked. Emily moved 3 times in less than 2 years. Naomi pointed toward the dates. Every time she relocated, someone found her. Alexander felt a chill settle across his shoulders. "Found her?" Naomi nodded. "Not with threats. Not with anything dramatic." She paused. "Just reminders." Reminders of what? That certain doors would remain closed. Silence filled the room. Alexander remembered the influence his family possessed during those years. The foundations, the attorneys, the advisors, the connections stretching through business, politics, and philanthropy. Suddenly, actions that once seemed impossible felt disturbingly realistic. "Why did she never come directly to me?" he asked. Naomi's expression softened. "Because eventually she stopped believing she could reach you." The answer hurt more than he expected. Somewhere along the way, Emily had concluded that the distance between them could not be crossed. Whether that distance came from circumstance or interference no longer mattered. The result was the same. A little girl grew up without answers. Alexander picked up the photograph of Lily again. "Does she know her mother's full story?" Naomi shook her head. "Only parts." "Does she know about me?" "Only that her mother once cared deeply about someone." Alexander exhaled slowly. "Nothing more." "Emily wanted the truth to come from you." The irony almost made him laugh. For 8 years he had known nothing. Yet Emily had trusted him with a conversation she never got the chance to have. His phone vibrated again. This time it was a call. Victoria Hayes. Naomi noticed immediately. Neither spoke. The device continued ringing between them. Alexander looked at the photograph, then at Emily's letter, then at the contract still sitting untouched beneath everything else. A few hours earlier, he believed this evening was about creating a future. Now he was discovering a past that had been hidden from him. The phone continued ringing. Finally, he answered. "Mother." For a moment, only silence greeted him. Then Victoria's familiar voice filled the room. Calm, controlled. "Is Naomi Carter still there?" Alexander glanced toward Naomi. "Yes." Another pause. "Ask her to leave." The request came so quickly that it felt rehearsed. Alexander's expression hardened. "Why?" "Because this discussion concerns family matters." He looked down at the photograph of Lily. "That is exactly why she is staying." Silence followed. Longer this time. When Victoria spoke again, her voice had changed. Not angry. Careful. "Alexander, there are things you do not understand." "Then explain them." "Not over the phone." "Why not?" Another pause. "Because some truths are easier to manage in person." Naomi lowered her eyes. The statement clearly did not surprise her. Alexander felt something shift inside him. For years he had accepted explanations, accepted decisions, accepted narratives handed to him by people he trusted. Tonight felt different. "Were you aware of Emily's child?" he asked. The silence that followed lasted nearly 5 seconds. It was the longest silence of the entire conversation. Then Victoria answered. "I think we should speak face to face." Alexander closed his eyes briefly. He no longer needed an answer. Not really. Because sometimes silence revealed more than words ever could. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at Naomi. "Where is Lily right now?" Naomi hesitated. "At home with her foster family." Alexander nodded slowly. "Good." Then he ended the call. Naomi watched him carefully. "What are you thinking?" Alexander picked up the photograph and stared into the familiar eyes of the little girl smiling back at him. "I am thinking," he said quietly, "that before this night is over, I want the truth from the one person who has been avoiding it the longest." For several moments after ending the call, neither Alexander nor Naomi spoke. The penthouse felt different now. Smaller somehow. The carefully controlled world Alexander had built around himself seemed to be narrowing toward a single unavoidable question. What had his mother done 8 years ago, and why? He picked up Emily's photograph once more. The image no longer felt like evidence. It felt personal. The smile on her face belonged to someone who had trusted him. Someone who apparently believed he would eventually learn the truth. The thought was difficult to carry. "When is she coming?" Naomi asked quietly. Alexander glanced at his watch. If she left immediately, less than 30 minutes. Naomi nodded. She seemed unsurprised. Victoria Hayes was not known for avoiding confrontation when something important was at stake. Alexander walked toward the window again. The storm had completely passed now. The city glowed beneath the night sky. Traffic moved through the streets far below. People continued living ordinary lives while his own history rearranged itself piece by piece. "Tell me something honestly," he said without turning around. "Did Emily ever hate me?" Naomi answered immediately. No, the certainty in her voice surprised him. "How can you know that?" "Because she talked about you often." Alexander turned. "After everything?" Naomi nodded. "Especially after everything." The answer settled heavily between them. "Then why keep Lily away from me?" Naomi looked down at the notebook. "That was never her plan." Alexander frowned. "Then what was?" "She wanted you to know." Naomi's voice softened. "She just never found a way to reach you." Silence followed. Alexander believed her. More than that, he wanted to believe her. It was easier than imagining Emily deliberately hiding a child from him. Yet easier did not mean less painful. Every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. A knock interrupted the silence. Both looked toward the entrance. Alexander checked the time. 23 minutes. Faster than expected. His expression hardened. "That will be her." Naomi slowly gathered the letters into a neat stack. "Are you sure you want me here?" Alexander looked at her. "Absolutely." A few moments later, the penthouse doors opened. Victoria Hayes entered without hesitation. Even at 68, she carried herself with remarkable confidence. Elegant navy coat, perfect posture, controlled expression. She looked every bit like the woman whose name appeared on hospitals and scholarship programs throughout the Midwest. Yet the moment her eyes found Naomi, something changed. It lasted less than a second. A flicker. Recognition. Then it disappeared. Behind practiced composure. Alexander noticed it immediately. "You know her." Victoria removed her gloves calmly. "We have met." Naomi remained seated. "Only once." Victoria nodded slightly. "Many years ago." The admission instantly transformed the atmosphere. Alexander stared at his mother. "You told me you did not know who she was." Victoria looked toward him. "Because the details were not important." "Not important?" His voice sharpened. "A woman arrives carrying letters from Emily Harper, photographs of a little girl, and evidence that someone may have interfered in my life. And you think the details are not important?" Victoria exhaled slowly. "Alexander." "No," he stepped closer. "You knew Emily." "Briefly." "Did you know she was pregnant?" For the first time, Victoria did not answer immediately. The hesitation was enough. Naomi lowered her eyes. Alexander felt his stomach tighten. "You knew?" Victoria walked toward the table and looked down at the photograph of Lily. Her expression softened in a way Alexander had never seen before. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated. Regret perhaps. "I knew there was a possibility," she said quietly. The room fell silent. Alexander stared at her. "A possibility?" "Emily contacted me." Victoria's voice remained calm. "She said she was expecting a child. And she wanted to see you." Alexander felt anger rising for the first time all evening. "What did you do?" Victoria looked at the photograph for several seconds before answering. "I made a choice." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. She already knew what was coming. Alexander did not. "Not yet." "What choice?" Victoria finally looked up. Her voice was steady, but there was sadness in it now. Real sadness. At the time, Hayes Biotech was days away from collapsing. Investors were leaving. Lawsuits were pending. You were working 20 hours a day trying to save the company. She paused. "I believed Emily's arrival would destroy everything you had built." Alexander felt disbelief wash over him. "So you decided for me." Victoria said nothing. "You decided I should never know." Still silence. The absence of a denial felt louder than any confession. Then Victoria looked directly at Naomi and spoke the words that changed everything once again. "What neither of you understand is that Emily came back to see me one final time after Lily was born." The confession settled over the penthouse like a weight nobody could immediately lift. Victoria remained standing beside the table, her eyes fixed on the photograph of Lily. Alexander stared at his mother in disbelief. Naomi sat quietly, watching years of hidden history finally surface. "She came back?" Alexander asked. His voice sounded distant even to himself. Victoria nodded slowly. 3 months after Lily was born. The room fell silent again. "Why?" Alexander demanded. Victoria lowered herself into a chair for the first time since arriving. The confident woman who normally controlled every conversation suddenly seemed older, tired, because she wanted certainty. Alexander frowned. Certainty about what? Victoria looked directly at him. About you. Those two words landed harder than expected. Victoria folded her hands together. Emily told me she did not want money. She did not want publicity. She did not want access to the company. Naomi listened carefully. This was the first time she had heard this part of the story. Then what did she want? Alexander asked. Victoria's eyes drifted toward the city lights beyond the windows. She wanted to know whether you would choose her and Lily if you knew they existed. Silence followed. Alexander felt his chest tighten. And what did you tell her? Victoria hesitated. The pause alone revealed more than any answer could. Mother. Victoria exhaled slowly. I told her you had moved on. The words struck him immediately. You lied. I believed I was protecting you. You lied. His voice grew firmer. Victoria nodded. Yes. The admission hung heavily in the room. For years, Alexander had accepted countless difficult decisions made in the name of protecting the company, protecting investors, protecting employees, protecting the family legacy. But this was different. This was personal. What exactly did you tell her? Victoria looked down at the table. I told her you were engaged. Alexander stared at her. I was not. I know. I was not even dating anyone seriously. I know. The repetition only deepened the pain behind her voice. Naomi glanced toward Emily's letter. Suddenly, many pieces began fitting together. Emily believed Alexander had chosen another life, she said quietly. Victoria nodded. That is what I wanted her to believe. Alexander felt anger rising inside him. Not explosive anger. Something quieter. More painful. Why? Victoria finally looked at him. Tears shimmered faintly in her eyes. Because I was afraid. The answer surprised everyone. Alexander stared at her. Afraid of what? Victoria laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Losing everything. She looked around the penthouse. 8 years ago, the company was collapsing. Banks were nervous. Investors were leaving. Every day brought another crisis. Her voice trembled slightly. I convinced myself that if you became distracted, everything would fall apart. Alexander shook his head. So you decided my daughter was a distraction. Victoria closed her eyes. The word daughter seemed to affect her deeply. At the time, I told myself she would be better off away from all of this. Naomi's expression hardened. And did you ever ask Emily what she wanted? Victoria said nothing. Did you? Naomi repeated. No, the answer came quietly. Another silence followed. Alexander walked back toward the window. His reflection stared back at him against the dark glass. Somewhere in Milwaukee, a little girl was sleeping peacefully, unaware that 3 adults were discussing decisions that shaped her entire life. The thought broke something inside him. What happened when Emily left? He asked. Victoria looked down at her hands. I thought that was the end. But it was not. No, her voice softened. About a year later, I received another letter. Alexander turned immediately. Another letter? Victoria nodded. From Emily. Naomi leaned forward slightly. This was new information even to her. What did it say? Alexander asked. Victoria reached into her purse. For a moment, nobody moved. Then she removed a folded envelope. Yellowed with age. Carefully preserved. The sight of it sent a chill through the room. I kept it all these years, Victoria whispered. Alexander stared at the envelope. Why? Victoria's eyes filled with regret. Because it was the moment I realized I had made a terrible mistake. Slowly, she placed the envelope on the table beside Emily's photograph. Alexander looked from one letter to the other. 8 years of silence resting side by side. What was inside? He asked. Victoria swallowed hard. A photic. The words remained suspended in the air long after Victoria finished speaking. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The photograph of Lily sat between them on the table, no longer just a picture, but a symbol of every year that had been lost. Alexander stared at his mother. For perhaps the first time in his life, he saw her not as the woman who always had answers, but as someone carrying the weight of a decision she could never undo. You kept the letter, he said quietly. Victoria nodded. Yes. For 7 years. Yes. And you never told me. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. I wanted to. Alexander laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. That is the problem with good intentions. The room fell silent again. Naomi sat quietly, allowing the conversation to unfold. This was never about punishment. It was about truth. Emily had understood that. Naomi understood it too. Alexander picked up the envelope Victoria had brought and carefully removed the contents. Inside was a faded birthday photograph. A tiny girl sat in a high chair wearing a paper crown while smiling at the camera. One candle stood on a small cake. 1 year old. One birthday. One moment he would never get back. He stared at the image for several seconds before lowering it beside the newer photograph Naomi had shown him. The difference was striking. A baby becoming a child. Years passing between two pieces of paper. Years he had missed completely. What happened after this? He asked. Victoria looked down. I wrote to Emily. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. You did? Victoria nodded. I apologized. The answer surprised everyone. And? Alexander asked. Victoria took a slow breath. The letter came back. Silence followed. Why? Because Emily had moved. Victoria hesitated. By then she was already receiving treatment in another state. Naomi looked toward Emily's original letter. The timeline suddenly made more sense. You lost contact. Victoria nodded. Completely. Alexander stared at her. Then why did you never try harder? Victoria's face tightened. Because every year that passed made the truth more difficult. The answer felt painfully honest. Alexander understood it immediately. A lie told for one day can be corrected. A lie carried for years becomes a wall. Eventually people stop seeing a path through it. So you did nothing. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. Not exactly. She reached into her purse once more. This time she removed a thin folder. What is that? Alexander asked. The reason I came tonight instead of ignoring your call. Slowly, she slid the folder across the table. Alexander opened it. His eyes moved across several pages before stopping. Foster care reports. School evaluations. Medical checkups. Lily's name appeared throughout the documents. He looked up sharply. You were tracking her. Victoria nodded. From a distance. Naomi stared at her in disbelief. You knew where she was all this time? Not at first. Victoria's voice trembled slightly. But after Emily passed away, I hired someone to make sure Lily was safe. Alexander looked down at the papers again. Every year was documented. School achievements. Teacher comments. Volunteer activities. Birthday photographs. Small milestones preserved in files. You watched her grow up. Victoria nodded. Yes. But you never visited. No, you never told me. No, the answers came quietly. Alexander turned another page. A second-grade report card. A drawing competition certificate. A photograph from a school science fair. He stared at them all. Evidence of a life unfolding just beyond his reach. Then something caught his attention. A handwritten note clipped to the most recent report. He removed it carefully. The handwriting was childish but neat. It appeared to be part of a classroom assignment. My biggest wish is to meet my dad someday. The room became completely silent. Victoria looked away immediately. Naomi lowered her eyes. Alexander read the sentence again. Then a third time. Not because he misunderstood it. Because he could not stop imagining the little girl who wrote it. Somewhere in Milwaukee, Lily had completed a school assignment without knowing that her father was reading it less than 100 miles away. Alexander swallowed hard. How old is she now? He asked quietly. 8, Naomi answered. 8 years old. Old enough to ask questions. Old enough to dream. Old enough to wonder why nobody had come. Alexander carefully folded the note and placed it beside Emily's photograph. Then he looked at both women. Tomorrow morning, he said. I am going to Milwaukee. Naomi's expression softened immediately, but Victoria's face changed. Not with fear, with concern. Alexander. He looked at her. What? Victoria hesitated. There is something else you need to know before you meet Lily. The words immediately changed the atmosphere again. Alexander felt his stomach tighten. Another secret. Another missing piece. Another truth waiting in the shadows. What now? He asked. Victoria looked down at the table, then back toward him. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Lily does not know her real last name. The statement immediately stopped every other thought in the room. Alexander stared at his mother, unsure whether he had heard her correctly. What do you mean she does not know her real last name? Victoria looked exhausted now, as though every secret she carried had become heavier with each passing minute. Naomi sat quietly, listening. Even she did not know where this revelation was leading. Victoria reached for one of the documents in the folder and slid it across the table. Alexander picked it up. The name printed at the top read Lily Harper. He frowned. That was Emily's last name. Victoria nodded. Yes. Then what is the problem? Victoria hesitated. Because that is not the name Emily intended Lily to keep forever. Silence followed. Alexander looked back down at the document. Explain. Victoria folded her hands together. After Lily was born, Emily completed paperwork that was never finalized. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of paperwork? Guardianship instructions. Personal records. Letters. Victoria paused. And a sealed declaration. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. A declaration of what? Victoria looked directly at him. Of parentage. The room became completely still. Alexander stared at her. You mean she officially identified me? Victoria nodded slowly. Yes. Naomi exhaled softly. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Then why was it never completed? Alexander asked. Victoria lowered her eyes. Because I intervened. The admission hung heavily between them. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Every answer seemed to lead back to the same source. The same decision. The same mistake. You stopped it. Yes. Why? Victoria's voice trembled. Because at the time I believed the fewer official connections that existed, the easier it would be for everyone to move forward. Alexander laughed quietly. The sound carried more sadness than anger. Move forward. He looked at the photograph of Lily again. She spent 8 years growing up without answers. Victoria nodded. I know. Emily died believing I abandoned them. Victoria lowered her head. I know. And now an 8-year-old girl thinks her father never came looking for her. Tears filled Victoria's eyes. I know. The repetition only deepened the pain in the room. Naomi looked toward Alexander. Throughout the evening, she had watched him process shock, confusion, grief, and regret. But something else was emerging now. Determination. For the first time, he seemed less focused on what had happened and more focused on what came next. What exactly did Emily write? He asked. Victoria blinked. What? The declaration. He pointed toward the folder. What did she say? Victoria reached into the papers and removed a sealed document. The envelope had never been opened. The sight alone stunned Naomi. You never read it? She asked. Victoria shook her head. No, for 8 years. I could not. Alexander accepted the envelope carefully. The paper showed signs of age but remained intact. His name was written across the front in Emily's handwriting. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Then he opened it. The room fell silent as he unfolded the pages. The first section contained legal language, names, dates, signatures. But it was the final page that caught his attention. A handwritten note attached to the declaration. He began reading. If you are reading this, then something finally changed. Maybe time softened old fears. Maybe someone found the courage to tell the truth. Or maybe Lily simply waited long enough. Alexander swallowed hard and continued. I never wanted her to inherit silence. I wanted her to inherit honesty. If she ever asks about her father, tell her that I believed he would have loved her. Tell her I never doubted that. The words blurred slightly as emotion tightened his throat. Across the table, Naomi lowered her eyes. Victoria wiped away tears. Alexander continued reading. And if Alexander ever learns about this document, tell him something for me. Tell him that being a parent is not measured by the first 8 years he missed. It is measured by what he chooses to do after he learns the truth. The room remained completely silent. Slowly, Alexander lowered the page. Emily's words felt less like a message from the past and more like a challenge directed toward the future. He looked at Lily's photograph again, then at the contract still sitting untouched beneath the letters, documents, and memories scattered across the table. The irony was impossible to ignore. Hours earlier, he had been searching for someone willing to help him create a family. Yet everything now pointed toward a family that already existed. Naomi finally broke the silence. What are you going to do? Alexander looked at her. Then he looked at the $1 million contract. Without saying a word, he reached for it and slowly pulled it free from beneath the stack of papers. The room watched as he stared at the document that had started the evening. Then he folded it closed and set it aside. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I am not going to Milwaukee as a billionaire. He paused. His eyes settled on Lily's smiling face one more time. I am going as a father. The drive to Milwaukee began before sunrise. Alexander barely slept. Long after Naomi left the penthouse and long after Victoria returned home, he remained seated beside the table where everything had changed. Emily's letters, Lily's photographs, the declaration, the notebook. Every item remained exactly where it had been placed. By dawn, the $1 million contract had become the least important document in the room. The highway stretched ahead beneath a pale morning sky as Alexander drove north. For years he had traveled across continents for business meetings worth billions of dollars. Yet no journey had ever felt as important as the 90 miles separating him from an 8-year-old girl. Beside him sat Naomi. Neither spoke much during the drive. Some moments did not need conversation. They needed courage. By mid-morning they arrived at a quiet residential neighborhood lined with maple trees and modest homes. Children's bicycles rested on driveways. Wind chimes moved gently on front porches. The simplicity of the place felt worlds away from the penthouse overlooking Chicago. Naomi pointed toward a white house near the end of the street. That is where she lives. Alexander felt his heartbeat quicken. For a moment, he simply sat behind the wheel. What if she does not want to meet me? Naomi looked at him. Then you respect that. And if she is angry? Then you listen. Alexander nodded slowly. He appreciated the honesty. There were no guarantees waiting at the end of this story. Only possibilities. They walked up the front path together. Before either reached the door, it opened. A kind-faced woman in her 50s stepped outside. Naomi. Her smile appeared immediately. Then her eyes moved to Alexander. The smile softened into understanding. You must be him. Alexander swallowed hard. My name is Alexander Hayes. The woman nodded gently. I know. She stepped aside. Come in. The living room felt warm and lived in. Family photographs lined the walls. Children's drawings hung on the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway. Nothing about the house suggested wealth. Everything about it suggested love. She is in the backyard, the woman said quietly. She is nervous. Alexander felt his chest tighten. She knows I am here? The woman nodded. I told her someone important wanted to meet her. Naomi smiled softly. That was probably the safest way to explain it. The woman led them through the house and opened the back door. Sunlight spilled across the yard. A swing set stood beneath a large oak tree. Flower beds bordered a small wooden fence. Near the center of the yard sat a little girl drawing with colored pencils at a picnic table. Alexander stopped walking. The world seemed to narrow to a single point. Lily looked exactly like the photographs. Yet photographs had not prepared him for this. The way she tilted her head while concentrating. The way she tucked loose hair behind one ear. The way her eyes immediately lifted toward the sound of the door opening. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Lily stood. Her gaze shifted from Naomi to Alexander. Hi, Naomi. Her voice was bright but uncertain. Naomi smiled warmly. Hi, sweetheart. Lily looked back toward Alexander. Is this him? The question seemed to stop time itself. Alexander felt emotion rise in his throat. Naomi nodded gently. Yes. Lily studied him carefully. Not with fear. Not with excitement. Simply curiosity. The kind of curiosity only a child could carry so honestly. Alexander took a slow breath. Hi, Lily. She smiled slightly. Hi. Silence followed. Then Lily surprised everyone. You look like my drawing. Alexander blinked. Your drawing? Lily nodded and opened a notebook resting on the table. Inside was a sketch of a man standing beside a little girl beneath a tree. It was simple, childlike, yet unmistakably hopeful. I used to imagine what you looked like. Alexander felt his eyes sting. And Lily asked, was I close? He laughed softly through the emotion. Very close. Lily seemed pleased by that answer. Then she looked down briefly before asking the question that had waited 8 years to be spoken. Are you really my dad? Alexander knelt so he could meet her gaze. The backyard became silent. The wind moved softly through the trees overhead. Yes, he said quietly. I am. Lily stared at him for several seconds. Then she did something nobody expected. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Alexander closed his eyes as he hugged her back. 8 years of absence could not disappear in a single moment. Lost birthdays could not be recovered. Lost memories could not be recreated. But something else happened instead. A beginning. Behind them, Naomi wiped away tears. The foster mother smiled. Even Victoria's mistakes seemed smaller against the simple power of truth finally reaching the child who deserved it most. A few hours later, as sunlight filled the backyard, Lily sat beside Alexander showing him drawings, school projects, and stories from her life. He listened to every word. Not as a billionaire. Not as a CEO. not as a man searching for a future child, but as a father finally meeting the daughter who had been waiting for him all along.